And so for folks on video, just be aware that your video will come up as part of the recording. And so therefore, if you don't want that to happen, then you can go off camera. Good evening. My name is Andres Mantilla. I am a partner at BDS Planning. We've had the incredible task of working with the city of Portland on the findings that you will hear about today. I'm going to turn it over to Brian Scott, our managing partner, here in a second. But just to set the kind of flow of what the evening is going to look like today. Today we're here to present you with some recommendations, some initial recommendations. You might have questions. We want to hear those questions, but we're going to make sure that first we get through the presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. If you do have a question and you're in the room, you can obviously just save that question till the end. If you're online, you could put it in the chat if you like, and we have people monitoring the chat that will note that question and we'll come back to it at the end. Or you could also just wait until the end as well, and we'll make sure to call on folks. Today we have a pretty robust PowerPoint that really elevates national best practices around enhanced service districts or business improvement districts across the country. It really organizes our recommendations in, and when I say two buckets, one is how can the city of Portland internally coordinate better to support enhanced service districts, coordinating amongst the bureaus and coordinating with the ESDs themselves, stakeholders, and then some more external recommendations as well that really focus on things like governance, things like other improvements or other changes perhaps the city should consider in terms of how the ESDs operate and some of the requirements around that. So as I mentioned, what you'll see here is really based on our experience as a company doing this all around the country and really focusing and elevating national best practices, of which in some cases the districts are already operating, in other cases there's opportunities to make changes. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague Brian Scott to take us through the presentation, and then I'll come back towards the end to close this out.
Good afternoon, everyone, and everyone that's online. Good to see you. Thanks for turning out for this. I'm Brian Scott with BDS Planning. Our agenda, spend a minute on welcome and introductions, talk about the purpose of this assessment and recommendations that we're doing and the process that we're going through it. I want to give an overview of place management nationally and best practices, and then walk one by one. The bulk of this will be on assessment of what's happening in Portland and recommendations for how that can be approved. And then we'll talk, the next steps will be about your opportunity to comment on these draft recommendations before we make final presentation to the City Council in February. As Andres mentioned, we are BDS Planning. Four of us working on this project. Our partner Ishmael Nunez was here early on in the project. In the room today, myself, Andres, and Jenny Kowalczyk. My own experience with districts like Portland's Enhanced Services Districts, I was going to say goes back to 1985 when I helped write Oregon's enabling legislation for economic improvement districts. But then just sitting in this room, I realized maybe it goes back to when I was in college at Oregon State and I came up to Portland to watch Michael Graves' presentation about the design for this building. Helped create these districts in Oregon, and then played a consulting and facilitation role with the folks at Association for Portland Progress that set up what is now the Downtown Clean and Safe District, and then helped them as they navigated ballot measure 5 in 1990 through 1994 to change it into pretty much the district that's still in place today and try and make that set up. So been doing this a long time. Founded this firm 15 years ago in Seattle after being in Portland until just about then, and started working across the country on similar districts based on experience across Oregon. I got to know Andres a dozen years ago when he was at the city of Seattle in a job very much like Devin Reynolds' job, who's on the call here and has just joined the city of Portland as the ESD coordinator. At that time, Andres was the city of Seattle's coordinator of their business improvement areas. He was my client as I was helping set up some districts across the city. And in various capacities, we've been working on this stuff together since then. Jenny has actually been an employee of 3 of these districts, 2 in Seattle and 1 in Michigan. So she's had a lot of experience being inside the district. So we've been doing this a lot of time in a lot of different places, which gives us good perspective as well as a history here. Our firm is 15 people. We've been around for 15 years. We envision vibrant, just, and thriving communities. Our work centers around consensus facilitation, inclusive process, organizational development, and place management, like ESDs. We've worked in about 15 states and done work on districts like this in most of them. Current work in the last year in Austin, Texas, Chicago, Indianapolis, Washington, D.C., Rochester, New York, downtown Seattle, several neighborhoods in Seattle. We've done a lot of this work in a lot of places that's fairly relevant to this work. So that's who we are. Moving into this project. So first of all, Portland's Enhanced Services District Program, or ESDs, they're intended to provide enhanced services beyond basic city services governed by the city code, chapter 6.06. They're proposed at the district or neighborhood level by the stakeholders that are going to be involved in them and pay into them. Property managers pay a license fee, which is collected by the city. The city contracts with the districts or distributes the fee to the districts to a nonprofit created in each district specifically to manage and provide the services that the district is to pay for. Currently, each of the ESDs in Portland then in turn contracts with another nonprofit to manage the services. The city oversees the enhanced services programs to ensure they align with the city's goals and standards and align with the ordinance that actually is created for the city council. So that's what the program that we're assessing and recommending is. There are 3 operating enhanced services districts in Portland. By far the oldest is the Clean and Safe District on the west side of the Willamette River. As I mentioned, it was first created in 1988, got completely reinvented in 1991 and again in 1994 as a result of ballot measure 5. And it's been in place more or less like from 1994 since then. Much more recently, the Lloyd District created a district in the early 2000s, and the Central East Side created a district just a few years ago. So 2 newer districts in Portland. There have been some efforts to try and create them in other neighborhoods that haven't gotten very far. It's worth looking at that map for a second. As you think about some of the things that are happening in this district, you'll know that the Central East Side District is bigger than the Downtown Clean and Safe District, even though the Clean and Safe District on the west side of the river has a much bigger budget. So those are relevant details to these folks operating. The services are this list of the various things that these districts do locally and nationally. These are all things that are in the mutual interest of the users of these properties in the district. The Downtown Clean and Safe District has a budget of $5 or $6 million. They do cleaning, safety, community health outreach, crow abatement, business development support, and holiday lighting programs that are through that district. The Lloyd District has a budget of about $600,000, transportation management, the Echo District, trash collection, neighborhood and community association, street lighting, street landscaping on Holiday Street, and advanced advocacy and promotion for the district. The Central East Side Together District has a budget of about $1.8 million. They do cleaning, graffiti removal, safety, mural preservation and development, and district enhancement. You can see that the Clean and Safe budget is much bigger for a smaller footprint, so that it just creates one of the dynamics among the programs. Based on pushback from some citizens and ratepayers in these districts, the city conducted an audit of this program in 2020. The auditor found that there was inadequate city oversight of services, formation or governance of the ESDs, that the ESDs may be providing basic city services rather than services that are supplemental and beyond the city's basic responsibilities. And also that the ESD services decisions are being made opaquely by ratepayers rather than by public officials. So those are the kind of headline findings of that study. There were concerns about the accuracy and balance of the audit findings, both by the ESD and themselves and others, about how the audit was based on. In response to the audit, the city hired an ESD coordinator position. And they filled it twice. They filled it a couple of years ago. That person left, and now Devin Reynolds has been on board for about 6 weeks in that position. New, and he's here in the meeting today. There were the first ESD coordinator held a number of public meetings and received community input. Our team has read the audit, and we've watched the recordings of those public meetings, and we've read the input that came into that. So that's part of the input into this process. And as a result of the audit, the city has adopted a more formal ESD renewal process that the Clean and Safe program went through last year, and the Lloyd District is in the process of right now. So there's been some response to that. Our process, beginning in September, was to do an assessment of where the program is, to make recommendations about where do we want to go, and then work on implementation about how we're going to get there. We have talked to dozens of stakeholders who are part of the ESD districts themselves, and folks that have concerned citizens, folks that turned up at those community meetings and recorded their name and said they wanted to be involved. We've reached out to most of them, had multiple conversations with folks, done some focus groups, talked to anyone who raised their hand, basically. We've talked to folks internal to the city in the ESDs themselves. We're making preliminary recommendations today, opportunity for feedback for the next month, and then we'll make final presentation to the council in February. The purpose of our assignment is to review the city's current processes and procedures for forming and administering the ESDs. In consultation with the stakeholders who are involved in the program, develop recommendations to improve the current system, rules and regulations, to be responsive to the findings of the 2020 audit, which was of the programs recommending improvements of the rules and procedures for district formation, allowable scope of services within public spaces, inclusive of governance, transparency, and reporting, and to make recommendations for effective ongoing city oversight of the ESD. So trying to do that today. So that's who we are, what we're doing. I want to take a few minutes to talk about how do these things that in Portland you call enhanced services district work nationally. The national kind of jargon for this is place management or place management districts. They are frequently called business improvement areas, but that changes in Washington. They're business improvement areas. In Oregon, as I mentioned, the economic improvement districts, and it's like alphabet soup across the country. But place management tends to be the group thing. In our experience, successful districts require economic fundamentals, design and development principles, and sustained marketing and promotions. But maybe most importantly, strong leadership and consistent management is what successful urban areas require. The good news about enhanced services districts is they can pay for those things. And that's essentially what they are, as a funding tool. Vitality depends on marketing and promotions, environmental services, hospitality and safety, planning and design improvements, retail and business strategies, and strong management. Enhanced services districts are a way to pay for those things to help enhance the districts. What is this thing? What is a place management district? It's enacted by the city council. It's an assessment, depending on where you are, on properties and or businesses. In Portland, it's an assessment on property management, the privilege of property management within the district. How you do the assessment is largely a local preference, whether it's on square footage or value or sales or whatever. It's maybe the best thing about them is they're managed right in the neighborhood where they created. They're managed by the people that are paying into them. Typical services include public realm and physical improvements, public events and promotion, retail promotions, transportation services, parking, leadership, cleaning, safety, are typical services in these districts. The history of these, where did they come from? The 1950s were a bad decade for America's downtowns. We had the GI Bill and the interstate highway system basically using federal money to pay for the suburbs being developed. We had urban renewal and redlining damaging a lot of the inner city spaces. So downtowns, it was a tough decade for downtowns. In the 1960s, downtowns began organizing to try to fight back, say these suburban malls are killing us, and how do we get more organized like that? In the 1970s, the notion of public area maintenance started to emerge. Mostly that was physical stuff, taking care of public space in downtowns. In the 80s and 90s, trying to pay for that consistently for a long time and recognizing it wasn't just planting some trees or putting up some matching pavers, but you had to actually manage it for a long time. And the notion of assessment districts emerged. Portland was one of the first cities that really stepped into that in a really big way. One of the first things that property and business owners wanted was more cleaning and safety. That was one of the things they were most concerned about at first. By the 2000s, many other districts were forming. Neighborhoods outside of center cities were doing this. There was more programming, more social services. Today, there are thousands of place management districts across the United States, across Canada. The International Downtown Association estimates 4,500 such organizations around the world. Handful of examples. In Austin, Texas, they created a downtown district in 1993. Its current budget is about $12 million. It covers most of the center city. There's the state capitol. There's the Colorado River. The assessment is about $10 million out of their $12 million budget. Property owners in the district pay 92 cents per $1,000 of value for the property to raise that $10 million. And they only pay on improvements value above $500,000. The activities are professional management, clean and safe, downtown ambassadors, economic development, park management. This is one of the parks downtown that they manage. In Washington, D.C., the district was created in 1997. The assessment's about $10 million. Commercial property pays 17 cents per building square foot. Hotels pay $95 per room per year. Residential properties pay $120 per unit per year. Activities are professional management, environmental services, hospitality and safety, homeless services, public space, transportation, economic development. The district goes from the White House is right down here. Capitol Hill is right over here. Several things that you see in the national news happen in this district on a regular basis, including things in public space. When the president walks across the street to do a publicity stunt and people are protesting, that's in this district. One of the other things they do that's really interesting is they run a day drop-in center for folks experiencing homelessness in Washington, D.C. And there's a place there for people to take a shower, get their laundry done, talk to somebody about how to find a job or find housing, or just sit around and watch television and get cleaned up. Downtown Seattle, a little closer, a place probably most of the folks in this meeting have been to. They created a district like this, actually modeling it after Portland's district at the time in 1999, was renewed and expanded earlier this year. Their assessments grown to $18 million. They pay 37 cents per $1,000 of total appraised value for properties, plus 45 cents per land square foot. So those two factors make up the basic assessment. Nobody pays more than 24 cents per building square foot. Hotels are limited to $125 per room per year. Residential units are limited to $195 per unit per year. Their activities are professional management, cleaning services, hospitality and safety ambassadors, private security, activating public space, park management, and advocacy. Start to see a pattern here of what people tend to pay for with these by their own choice. This area covers from Seattle Center at the north, doesn't include Seattle Center, down to the stadiums in the south and between I-5 and Elliott Bay. Also in Seattle and immediately south of this, touching it on the south end, is the SoDo, or south of downtown district. It goes from the stadiums at the north down to the railroad cut at the south. This is the Starbucks world headquarters in the foreground of this photo. A lot of rail yards, a lot of industrial uses. Their budget, they were created in 2013, renewed and expanded in 2018. Their budget's about $2 million. This area is a lot like the Central East Side in Portland. Their rate is 50 cents per $1,000 of total taxable value. It's one of the simpler rates that I've worked with. They do professional management. They clean up illegal dumping. They do homeless outreach. They do pressure washing. They do graffiti removal. They provide district info, and they make connections to appropriate services for people in need. This is a place that a guy out there with a broom wouldn't do any good because it's such a huge district and it has so many things. So they really target their services to relate to their own district. One of the coolest things they've done is they call it the SoDo track. If you take the light rail from the airport to downtown Seattle, as you come in to where you can see downtown, you pass 50 spectacular murals along the light rail line there. That's a whole program set up and run by this business improvement area. In Ballard, in northwest Seattle, a neighborhood many people have visited, we created a similar district in 2015, renewed and expanded it just a couple of months ago. Their budget has now grown to about $1 million. Their assessment is $12 per lot square foot plus 52 cents per $1,000 of total appraised value, with a limit of on residential properties of $130 per unit per year. And on nobody pays more than 20 cents per building square foot. Activities, professional management, public realm, advocacy, business support, events, and tourism program. One of the things that they're real proud of is when COVID broke out and people had to move their restaurants outside, they set up these streeteries. They got the whole city code changed to allow that. And I've had a lot of businesses say that they're only in business because of their district that helped them get that change in city policy. Why do people do this? Those are the end of my examples. In my experience, people create these districts to increase cleanliness, public safety, sales, and rents, make the district more vital, to reduce crime, to improve the district's image, to do public space activation, and by far that everyone pays their fair share. The advantage to getting the city council involved in this thing to create it in the first place is it means everybody has to pay. You could do most of these things by everybody throwing money in a hat voluntarily, but everybody wouldn't pay. And that drives the people that do pay crazy. So that's why these things get set up. And by now, after these things have been around for 50 years, it's amazing how many different things these districts are doing. Nobody's doing all of this stuff, but somewhere somebody's doing all of these things, from environmental services and hospitality to parks and public spaces, homeless services, economic development, beautification, marketing, promotions at events, and transportation. They're just doing a myriad of things in different places. The great thing about them is that people get to decide locally what's most important to them for their funding. This is basically a funding vehicle. Okay, that's all the background. Now let's get to talking about how's the program going in Portland. It started in the 80s, reinvented in the 90s. It's grown and changed since then. How's it going now? National and historical context, Portland started as a national model in the place management industry, but as everybody in the room and online knows, Central Portland is experiencing a crisis of confidence related to public safety, public drug use, remote work, office and retail vacancy, and low foot traffic. There was the business summit at the Moda Center yesterday with the governor and the mayor and the county chair all talking about opportunities to work with the business community to address some of these challenges. We all think that ESDs are an important part of this solution as well. Unfortunately, the ESDs are putting a disproportionate amount of their resources into clean and safe activities in response to the city's inability to maintain basic city services. We heard that about a lot from the ESDs themselves when we talked to them about, we're supposed to be doing all this marketing and activation and stuff, but we're just trying to do clean and safe because the city's not doing their job. We heard that a lot. The city's oversight of ESDs offers little guidance in forming or operating the ESDs. ESDs are not always aligned with national best practices. In a few places they are really well, but many places they're not. The assessment mechanisms themselves, that is how they assess the money, is often really complex and hard to verify. And the ESD governance lacks clarity at times. We got a lot of questions about how do you get on the board? How do the boards select it? How do the boards make decisions? We think this work we're doing right now with the city and the ESD is an opportunity to refresh the ESD program's vision, clarify its mission, and sharpen its operations. Just as a quick note, programs like this do lots of really good things for cities. This is an example of a before and after of a sidewalk cleaned by one of these districts. And that's stuff that the city wouldn't have gotten to in this case. And it was the district, you can see those out here doing the work of cleaning the sidewalk. That's the kind of thing these districts are doing for cities. There's another place where they're providing actually private security to support their cleaning crews and support important things. This one is obviously in front of the iconic Pike Place Market in downtown Seattle. Also, districts like this provide lots of activation of public space. Many of them are managing parks, open spaces, programming what's happening in public spaces, and putting activities out like this band in Austin. Austin's all about the live music. Their district puts a lot of live music out on the street to make sure they're living up to their reputation as the live music capital of the world. And they do lots of park activation like this park in a federal park in Washington, D.C., run by the downtown D.C. bid. Our assessment and recommendations of what's happening in Portland falls into 5 categories: the city's oversight of the program, assessment methodology, ESD governance, ESD operations, coordination, and collaboration. City oversight, our findings, national best practices. Most cities provide guardrails to district operations. Many cities provide support in forming and expanding the districts, and some cities actively support collaboration among the districts and with other economic development functions from the city and other entities in the community. In Portland, the city communication with and oversight of the ESDs is inconsistent. We heard that from everybody. We heard it from the ESDs. We heard it from the disgruntled stakeholders. We heard it from the city itself. There's little guidance or support for forming and expanding the ESDs, little coordination among the city bureaus that are interacting with the ESDs. We had at Andres' suggestion early in our process, we asked all the folks from the different city bureaus who interact with the ESDs to come together and talk to us about their experience. The biggest takeaway from that is they don't do that regularly. They don't get in a room together and talk about how does everything they're doing coordinate. And once they did, they thought, oh, we got to do this more often. And collaboration amongst the ESDs and with the city's economic development efforts is also inconsistent. I was sorry to see as the opportunity to come together and talk about the center city through the effort that was presented at the Moda Center yesterday, as that was emerging, the ESDs weren't central to it, which told me that they weren't sort of in everybody's head as part of the answer to the center city, which is, I think, a shame. So recommendations about city oversight of the ESDs. The city should develop a set of ESD guidelines for formation, operation, renewal, expansion, and dissolution of the district. So it's clear how that works. And of course, you hired Devin 6 weeks ago. This is Devin's work plan here, at least from my thought about things that need to happen. City also ought to have a handbook online to clarify the city's requirements and guidelines, as well as to highlight some of the great things the existing ESDs are doing. So there's a central place where, yeah, what do these things do and how do you do it? The city should continue charging all ESDs the same administrative rate. For a while, those weren't the same. They've been rectified now, but they should stay there. And then the internal city roles, as I mentioned, should identify internal city roles and at least biannual, at least twice a year, convene the ESD related agencies to compare information and update best practices and policies. I feel like a lot of this has moved in the right direction in the last few months, and it should keep going. Strong opportunity for improvement there. Moving to assessment methodology, that is, how do we calculate who pays what? National best practices, straightforward methodology. Information is posted transparently for ratepayers based on readily available public data. Include near all beneficiaries of district services. That means including residential, rental, and owner occupied as payers into the district. Most public agencies pay into the district, and most tax exempt uses like nonprofits and religious organizations. Because basically what the ESDs are doing is making it nicer to use the district in one way or another, make the district more vital. So everybody that's benefiting from that should pay some amount. Many communities jigger the amounts for equity among these different uses, but everybody should be is part of it. In Portland, the assessment methodology tends to be very complex, especially with the oldest district, the Clean and Safe District. The information is hard to find, and most beneficiaries are included. So actually, you're strongly in line with our national best practices there, as most everybody's paying into these districts. But for one reason or another, the calculation formula that's being used for the districts is complicated, particularly the oldest one, the Clean and Safe District, which I know how it got there. That made sense at the time. It's too complicated for what's happening now. It's not in line with national best practices. I can find several other examples of similarly complicated districts, but all of them are trying to simplify their formulas. So recommendations, first of all, data transparency. Encourage straightforward methodology, included data transparency to allow ratepayers to confirm assessment calculations and require readily available public information. The idea is a ratepayer, that is somebody that pays into the ESD, gets their invoice from the city that says you owe us $6,211.12. They should be able to look up what is the calculation that's based on the website of the ESD, and they should be able to go to the county assessor's website or some other really easy to find public place, look up how their property fits there, do the math, and come up with the same number that's on the invoice. It should be really clear how that works. I guarantee that can't be done now. It's not impossible, but it's close enough to impossible if nobody's doing it. Also, current data currency, requiring assessments to be based on reasonably up-to-date information. One thing that happens with these districts is everybody, when they get created, everybody gets used to paying something, and they get used to however much they pay compared to their neighbors. And over time, the properties change. People add and subtract to the size of their properties. The assessor has different opinions about the value. Different things change. The ESD assessment should change accordingly, and they've been kind of stagnant. In fact, the Clean and Safe methodology is still relating to values from 1994. In case anybody doesn't know, 1994 is a long time ago. and you can't even get that information readily online anymore. It's on microfiche. So you're actually basing it on data that's not well available anymore. The Lloyd District also has a set in time assessment based on 2010, which isn't as problematic yet, but it will be eventually. When you change the formula, you're going to create some people's assessments are going to go up and other people's are going to go down, and that's going to create a lot of tension. So first of all, we don't recommend that there's any change until the districts are up for renewal again. But when they come up for renewal, we suggest they be on readily available information, and then they be phased in over time. So people have an opportunity to budget and get used to making those changes, because the changes will be challenging. We also strongly think that residential assessments should continue, both rental residential and homeownership residential condominiums should continue to pay into the ESDs because they get benefits from all those services like others do. It may be appropriate to limit residential assessments in one way or another. You saw in the examples I gave that some of them limit it to a certain amount per unit, which would be less than the residential is paying in the districts in Portland right now. And in some other states, they pay a percentage of what commercial property pays. The argument for residential paying a little bit less than commercial property is if you had two properties right next to each other, the same size and shape, the residential building will be more valuable. And if both are fully occupied, the residential building will have less people in it than the commercial building. Just 1,000 square foot apartment probably has 1 or 2 people living in it. 1,000 square foot office probably has 4 to 6 people working. And also, if residential is going to pay, they should be represented on the ESD board, appropriate to the amount that they're paying. So if you're a condominium owner or a renter, you should be able to see your representative on the board and say that person is there representing me and my interests are being incorporated into the management of the district. Governance. National best practices, the districts contract with a district management association for operations, just like each of the ESDs do in Portland. Transparent board selection process that's open to all ratepayers. That is, you know how to get on the board, and it's anybody that's pays into the district has the opportunity to be on the board. If they want to, there's a way to get there. Agendas and minutes are available to ratepayers, at least, that is people that pay into the district, and maybe to the public. So that it's just really transparent. Public visibility of budgets, annual reports, milestones, finances, governance. Board meetings are open to ratepayers with clear ground rules for participation. They didn't always like to be this. Pretty much all of them were pretty closed early on, just by the people that first started them up. But over time, public interest and ratepayer interest in what's going on and how are you deciding whether we should, focus on cleaning or security or activation. How do you make those decisions? How do we know? Has made it the best practices moving toward much more open meetings, often with really strong ground rules. If you're not a board member, you can come to the meeting and watch, but you only get to comment during the open comment time. The rest of the time, you need to let us have our meeting. And also annual meetings that are open to the ratepayers, the people that are paying into the district, with opportunities for questions and suggestions. Many districts, but by no means all, have elections of board members at their annual meetings and or budget approval or priority work plan approval at their annual meetings. So more openness there. What we have found in Portland is it's hard to understand some of the governance procedures. We heard a lot about all the districts, about how that governance works was murky. Confusion about elections, decisions, priorities, and accountability. Lots of speculation and suspicion about what's happening. We heard a lot of that. I'm pretty sure everybody that's in the room or online is aware of that. This little diagram is an example of a typical way these things are managed, where you have the city council and the city administration. You have the ratepayers paying into this place management district, and they have a ratepayer board. And there's this association that has been hired to manage the district. It has members and it has an association board. The job of the ratepayer board for the ESD is to approve and monitor program priorities, the budget, and the performance. Deciding where we should place our money, what is the budget, and are we getting our money's worth? Is it happening? The city's job is to administer the collection of the assessments, ensure financial accountability, that what they're spending the money on relates to what the ordinance says, and that they're operating within whatever operating standards the city has. City actually collects the money and then moves the money to this management association, which is where the employees are and the services are actually happening. that association board is overseeing several things. They're overseeing this ESD funds and what they're doing with the ESD funds. They may well have other contracted services with other public agencies or other property owners to do a variety of things. And they probably or often have dues and donations that pay for membership services. And then they have executive administration keeping all of this stuff straight. So the ESD funds are used for ESD operations such as clean, safe, marketing, activation, the kind of stuff I was talking about, et cetera. Whatever other operations that they may be doing, which is their own business. And then they have membership services, which often include policy and public affairs kind of advocacy, but that should be paid for with dues and donations. The trick here is this needs to be kept really clear so people know what's happening. And the ratepayers over here who have agreed to a set of services don't feel like their funds are being moved from the things that they're paying for over into services for people that aren't ratepayers or to policy and politics kind of stuff that aren't what their district is paying for. So it's incumbent on best practices for that to be crystal clear. So our recommendations, first of all, transparency. The ESD board's role is programs, priorities, budgets, and accountability, like I just said. There should be transparency and clarity in the roles of the ESDs and the management associations. We heard a lot of confusion about what was the ESD paying for and were they paying for that other stuff that this association was doing. That needs to be made more clear. And then ESD board elections, meetings, agendas, and minutes need to be transparent so people know what's happening. Representation, the city should require ESD boards to represent all types and sizes of EST ratepayers in their city's ordinance and in the bylaws of the organizations themselves. So making sure everyone's represented. And then reporting, there should be annual meetings of the ESD ratepayers, and there should be reporting to the city. We're a little agnostic about how that actually works, whether you report to the ESD coordinator, the city employee, Devin Reynolds, or whether you're reporting to the city council, and whether that report is actually a presentation or whether it's a written report. Currently, the ESDs are reporting, making a public presentation to the city council, I think every year. We heard several people saying that may be overkill and taking more time in public meetings than is necessary, but we can give you lots of examples of different places that may be overkill. A lot of them, it's a written report or every 2 years or every 5 years or something, report to council. A requirement of that annual meeting, so it's very public, which tend to be very public meetings. Two more, I think, categories: ESD operations. National best practices is documentation of service outputs like litter and graffiti removal. Basic services agreements to maintain city services in coordination with place management district enhanced services. This is very much baked into most of the reasons these are set up. Is you get property and business owners saying, we're willing to put some more money into a pot because we don't think the city's doing enough. But what we don't want is the city to stop doing what they're doing now because we're putting in that extra services. So in most cases, including Portland, there's a deal that says the city will keep doing its services. Clean and safe services do make up considerable place management resources. That's pretty typical. But it's also important that they have resources for marketing, physical improvements, economic activation, and other services, and that those not get pulled into backfilling the city not meeting its obligations for cleaning and safety. And then it is also a national best practice that there are many subcontracted services for efficient operations using both local and national contractors to do those services. What we found in Portland is there is some documentation of service outputs. We think there could be more, but there is some. The city's challenges with basic services have pushed the ESDs into disproportionate clean and safe focus. We heard this lots. We heard that lots from the ESDs themselves. Is they like to do all those other things, but they get sucked into doing the clean and safe stuff because the city hasn't lived up to its end of the basic services agreement. And there's also, we heard a lot about challenging subcontracting requirements. making it hard for the districts to actually contract with local businesses because the city's subcontractor requirements were so onerous that they ended up having to hire big companies that could meet those standards. So recommendations, reporting, report revenue expenditures related to the ordinance that created the ESD itself. All the ordinances say, here's how you're going to pay this money. It's going to pay for this list of services. We think it makes great sense to report expenditures related to those categories, so it's real clear how you're spending your money. And report board member and ratepayer representation and selection process, so everybody that's paying knows how they're getting represented and how they participate. Basic services, rigorous adherence to the basic service agreements. The ESD should be passionate about holding the city up to its end of that deal. And subcontracting, we think the city should reconsider its guidelines for ESD procurement and subcontracting practices, which have in several instances pushed the ESDs to actually use national contractors instead of contractors based right there in their district who might have been able to provide the services, but they couldn't meet the city's standards. So fitting with how these things operate nationally, that would make sense. And then the final category is about coordination and collaboration. Basically, the best practices here is a lot of coordination and collaboration. Place management districts often form their own networks to promote idea sharing and collaboration. Good examples are the DC Bid Council, the Seattle BIAs, the California Downtown Association. New York City has an association of the districts that are there. And this basically the districts getting themselves together to up the game for what they're all doing. And also to push on the city collectively when they think the city needs to step up. In Portland, there's sporadic communication and coordination there, and there's confusion and lack of follow through on roles and responsibilities. So there hasn't been as much of this as there could be. Our recommendations are strong economic development collaboration between the ESDs, Prosper Portland, and the larger business community for the economic development, economic activation. It seems to us that Portland is in a place, the big event yesterday, and the Portland is what we make it campaign. There's a great opportunity for the ESDs to be part of the solution to Portland to taking itself to the place it wants to be. The ESD program should be in the Community and Economic Development Service Cluster that is being formed in the city's own organizational restructuring. We think it's very important that that's where it belongs, so that it naturally falls into coordination with those other programs. The city should facilitate strong collaboration among the ESDs on shared priorities and individual best practices. Strong coordination and reporting between Downtown Clean and Safe and the Portland Mall Management Incorporated. Clarifying services in contracting. Portland Mall Management Incorporated provides services along 5th and 6th Avenue, as well as the light rail route that goes east and west through downtown. That's all within the Downtown Clean and Safe program. We heard several people confused about, are we paying for this service twice? Who's paying for what? How does that work? So we think the city should be requiring strong collaboration and reporting to clarify how that all works, so ratepayers understand what they're getting. And then coordination standards and reporting among the city, the ESDs, and private security contractors. Currently, Portland has a lot of private security contractors who are providing a variety of security services. They're actually trying to compete with the ESDs at some level for some property owner monies for that. Maybe saying they're a better solution than the ESDs, which actually have a fair amount of public oversight. The private security might not. We think to the extent that everybody can coordinate and collaborate on what's happening to help take care of the public realm, that will be in everyone's best interest. That's our spiel. This session is being recorded and it'll be shared. You can get to it through the city's website. Our draft recommendations will go onto the city's website in the next couple of days, both this slideshow as well as a written report saying all these things in more complete sentences. Opportunity for comment on that through January 15th. And then we're scheduled to go to council in February. Andres, you want to take over while I cough?
Yeah.
For a second.
Great. So thank you, Brian. That was a lot of information. We are monitoring the chat for any potential questions. We want to take a few minutes to kind of open up any kind of comments or questions that you might have about some of the findings, with the understanding that kind of a official public comment, if you choose to enter it into the quote record, should be submitted by January 15th. So we're going to try to do this by monitoring the chat, monitoring folks that want to weigh in, and then open to the room here. So anybody in the room first that has any questions, comments?
A reminder to speak up since the microphone is here.
Yeah, and I'll do a job of repeating the question so that folks.
Needed for the sound.
Sure, and I will take down the presentation. I will attempt. Great. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a few questions. I might just start with like, and then if people online want to go, just in case there's some overlap.
Sure.
But the first thing, I actually have more questions about like your approach to the audit. So one of the things you brought up was there was concerns of accuracy and balance of the audit. But I was wondering if you could be more specific of what some of those were.
I think that there were in our both interviews, and I'm not going to say specifically who said what, because we didn't conduct interviews with that clarity, but some of the predetermined questions or positioning of the questions were leaning towards a certain outcome, a predisposed outcome, and that there was a inability to have some balance. And then we also saw a letter from the ESDs collectively calling out some issues and some questions, and then others had also raised some concerns.
Yeah, so what were some of those concerns?
That it wasn't representative of what was happening on the ground, that there were some assumptions made, that the survey that was released made some assumptions in the survey questions, and that led to predisposed kind of results. And so that was some of the feedback. Okay.
And then I was also just wondering, so in regards to talking to concerned citizens, so you reached out to most of the people in the public listening sessions. Did you reach out to the people who were the initial stakeholders from the audit?
Yes, we did. So a lot of the folks who were in those listening sessions and who had participated and originally engaged with, we worked with our client, the city, to be able to get a full list and a roster of folks that we should be communicating with. And not only did we look at all of the comments and the recordings and all the documentation, but re-engage with those people as well.
Okay, so you got a list of the people in the public listening sessions, but what about the original stakeholders from the audit?
Meaning who?
So like I was one of them.
Okay.
And no one really reached out to me or any of my colleagues. And I feel like I have a little bit of frustration around that, because some of the ways that the audit was framed and how it was formed, I feel like there was also some inaccuracies there. And I just feel like some of us who were involved with speaking as auditor and raising these concerns in the first place, like we would have loved to speak more about why we raised those issues, because there were some assumptions also made about us. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. Anybody online, any questions online? If you do want to participate, just go ahead and raise your hand. Your virtual hand. Anybody, any other questions or comments in the room? I don't see anybody.
We have Anita.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and unmute you, Anita.
Okay. It's a little delayed on our screen.
Anita, can you go ahead and try? Can you hear us okay?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I don't know if you can hear me. Anyway, I placed my question in the chat, and so maybe you can read it from there if you can't hear me.
Okay, we can hear you. I'm not sure you could hear us, but so we'll go ahead and read that question and then address it.
It's not in the chat yet.
Oh,
Right.
okay. I'll just read it anyway. I said, please explain. Well, first, thank you for all of this and we appreciate the information, but I'm still unclear and confused. Would you explain how single-family homeowners who are exempt in Portland in all 3 districts do not benefit from their ESDs, but you assume and recommend that condo homeowners do benefit? Could you please explain that?
Brian, you want to take that one?
Place management districts, in all cases that I'm aware of, are focused on mixed-use districts that have a considerable amount of multifamily housing, which is usually defined as housing with 4 or more units in a single structure. And in most cases, they do not include people that live in single-family detached homes, duplexes, or triplexes, some places in townhouses. And so the prevailing norm is to not assess the single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, or townhomes, but to assess multifamily housing, which is 4 more units. And I think the sensibility is there that that multifamily housing is part of an urban district with a certain amount of density and a certain amount of challenges and needing for clean and safe services. And folks have chosen to live there because of the urban vitality of the district. That is a prevailing, most common assessment mechanism national.
Thanks, Brian. Other comments, questions? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you for the presentation given. You gave an example of Ballard ESD. During COVID, the ESD was involved in helping businesses that deliver food stay in business, provide access to that service through modifying the streetscape to create those service locations that met, say, COVID criteria for beings. And I'm assuming such a service helped pretty much everyone in theory, like everyone in the district from an access to restaurant food perspective, for a business to continue to stay in business, the ability to attract people downtown. And in your presentation, you talked about how the ESD was involved with changing city code to help them. And one way of viewing that could be there's a function, and in some of the scope of work, some of the presentation examples you gave was advocacy, potentially lobbying work to change that city code on behalf of the ratepayers. And then in your slide where you laid out the different responsibilities between the big ratepayers, city administration, and the association with its members, is it in some bits where within their scope of work, what they're doing, where advocacy and lobbying work is part of that, is there sometimes an overlap of that kind of work where it's not so?
Yeah, you ask a good question.
Can we restate the question?
Yeah,
Can
let's
we restate the question?
So the point, which I think is a great question, is that in my example from Ballard, I said that the business improvement area, which is like your ESDs in Portland, was involved in advocacy for the district to try and get some city policy or code change to allow for those on-street dining, streetery is the jargon for it happening. And then the question was, but in my diagram, I was showing that the association should be doing the policy and public affairs work, and the ESD should be sweeping the street and doing tangible service. Good question. And in a place where the ESDs need to be real careful about what they're doing. And in my experience, the ESDs can effectively advocate for the district. You know, they can advocate for the city should locate facilities in our district, or the city should do its job cleaning up the trash or providing police protection in the district. And that is appropriate advocacy for the district. Whereas political lobbying, that is like helping candidates run for office or lobby for statewide tax policy or something, should be beyond something that's specifically about the interest of that district. And because that's, you know, a little subtlety in what I just said, the districts need to work to clarify, you know, who's doing what and what they're paying for and what those things are, because it's pretty common for an association like that to do some political lobbying, and they need to be clear that the assessment district funds are not being used for that. And that should be transparent to everybody, and it should be well documented. Is that address your question?
Yeah, and I assume the alternative to that is where district funds are being used for that advocacy work. That's a reasonable use too, where it benefits the district.
This actually pertains to a question in the chat. The question is, Brian, one of your slides about ESD governance had a slide with an org chart. Would you be able to bring that back up again and talk more in detail about the national best practice of that organizational chart? So do you mind?
That's the chart we were just talking about.
That's the chart we were just talking about.
I will attempt to do just that.
Slight delay.
Apologies.
The statement on the screen should be more. Is it tempting? Sure.
Get back to that slide.
Okay, so as we were writing sentences for our draft report and trying to realize that as we're talking about this, it gets a little confusing and hard to follow. We tried to make a diagram that is typical of how these districts work nationally. Now, there are as many different variations of this as there are states in the union, for sure, and probably as different districts. So this tried to be a generic model that says that there are 3 different organizations involved in this. There is the ESD, which is for the people can't probably see my hand waving that are online. So on the left side, you have the ESD, or these get called BIDs, business improvement districts. And I actually realized we need to edit the diagram. It says ESD over here and it says BID over here. We mean the same thing. It's the assessment district, the place management district, like Clean and Safe, Lloyd BID, and Central East Side together, like those districts that are in Portland. So there's that thing. There's a board made up of people who are paying into that district. And the job of that board is to make sure they get their money's worth for what they're paying into the district, essentially. And they're monitoring program priorities, budget, and performance. It is very common that those boards don't actually have much of an organization themselves. They're basically the board. They figure out how they want to get assessed. They talk the city into doing that. They make a deal with the city about the assessment. And then they hire another organization that already has staff and capacity to manage something to run the program. That is really common. And that's how it's being done in all 3 of the districts that are currently in place in Portland. It's how most of the districts in Seattle operate. There is, in downtown Seattle, there's the Metropolitan Improvement District, which raises the money through the assessment on property. And there is the Downtown Seattle Association, which is a membership association. That's quite a lot like Central East Side Together and the Central East Side Industrial Council, or Downtown Clean and Safe and the Portland Metro Chamber, recently known as the Portland Business Alliance. So very similar, and that's very typical all across the country. But the job of that ratepayer board is just to make sure they're getting their money's worth for the money that they're raising. The association, which would be, in this case, the Central East Side Industrial Council or the Portland Metro Chamber, or the Downtown Seattle Association in that example, it's a private nonprofit membership association created for the benefit of its members as the broader thing. And there's a strong intersection between the interests of its members and these ratepayers into this district, but they're not exactly the same thing. And so they're going to have a program. They're getting hired because they have staff and they have capacity to manage programs. And you don't want to create a whole nother administrative infrastructure for the ESD. They get this one program that has the ESD funds and whatever the ordinance says that they're supposed to do with those funds. They might well do some other stuff. They might contract with property owners who are outside of the ESD to provide some similar services. They might contract with the city to manage a city park. They might contract with another ESD to do some of the services for another ESD. There are a variety of things they could do. And they also might use their membership dues and private donations to lobby about business taxes in the region or the state, or back candidates, or do other things that legally an association could do with that. The city's job in this is to administer this district according to the ordinance. I've had many conversations with folks in city administrations who, when I'm saying, well, we meant to do this and this and this, and then somebody at the city says, my job is to do what it says in the ordinance, no matter what you meant to do. And so that's good. You've got those public officials. They're supposed to collect the funds in the way that it says in the ordinance. They're supposed to make sure that those funds get spent the way the ordinance says, and they're supposed to make sure that the operations are according to the city's standards. They're actually collecting the funds and then moving them to that management association who are doing the operations as dictated by that thing. And the ESD ratepayer board is annually setting priorities for how much money we're going to spend on these different programs, and then looking at the reporting that's being done by the staff to say, are we getting our money's worth? Should our priorities change? Do we think this management entity is doing a good job? And ultimately, the authority of that ratepayer board might be to say, we've lost faith in that management entity, and we think you should hire somebody else to do these programs. I've never seen that actually happen, but it is among the authority of that board would be to say, we want to hire somebody else to do that. It's important, because of the complexity of what I just said, to make it really clear that the ESD funds are going to run the ESD program. It may be appropriate for the association to say we need a 10% administration fee or something for managing this, but it should be clear that we're paying for the services that we're paying for, and we're not paying for whatever else you might want to do in your organization. That's not unlike, if I'm hiring an accountant, or if I'm hiring a lawyer to do something, my bidding. The lawyer's got other clients too, and I don't want to be using my money to help them. So it's just trying to keep clear what's happening there. And I hope that was helpful in responding to that question.
And it is also very common, there's some other questions here, I see one here, that there's shared staff responsibilities across the functions that Brian just mentioned. And that's perfectly okay to share staff. I mean, these are organizations that have at times capacity issues of themselves. And then having the clarity in terms of what Brian just said is equally important. So that is a best practice that we see across the country. So go in the room here, and then we have some more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the ratepayer board. And in your assessment, did you actually meet people who are on ratepayer boards?
Yes, we did. In all three districts.
Okay, as ratepayer, I've never heard of that. And it seems like all I know is that we're told how much we're going to pay, and we pay it, and we don't really have any input into what actually happens to that. So is it Is it something we can access? Is it,
Can you clarify your question? 'Cause I'm not sure.
well, how do I know who's on my ratepayer board?
Okay.
Clean and safe.
I think that is an.
You're not the only person that asked that question.
That is reflected in our
And that's
recommendation.
part of our recommendations is it could be clearer. Remember that ratepayer board is in the room.
You've met them. I mean,
Yes.
We met some of them. We haven't met all of them, but we've met some of them and staff members and our recommendation is that the city encourage the ESDs to be more clear in their public information about who's on those boards and how you would get on the board if you got the notion that you want to be on them.
And just to be clear, it is not our assessment that there's anything nefarious happening in any of the ESDs that we worked or interviewed. Clarity, additional clarity is something that we said could help kind of sharpen the ESD program and answer some of these questions that you.
So the ESDs are actually driving the ratepayer board then? It's not like an equal
The ESD ratepayer board,
responsibilities.
the ESD ratepayer board should be driving what the ESD programs and services are.
The ESDs and the ratepayer boards do the same thing. The ratepayer board is the ESD.
I have a question in the chat.
You,
What are some best practices for keeping the government accountable to their basic services?
Great.
But let's hold that one a second. Your question is probably related to this question.
I've got two. The first one would be, you talked quite a bit about the importance of collaboration and coordination between ESDs and city.
Yeah.
So if that hasn't been so great, I think you pointed to that, and the ESD uses a person and their sole job is try to influence city direction. That's a method of coordination and collaboration, although it may not sound like it. I'm just curious your thoughts on essentially a person whose job is to try to influence the city in a direction that the ESD feels is appropriate.
So coordination, collaboration, how to get information to ESDs and from ESDs to city services, how to coordinate city services at the ESD level, collaborate when a certain bureau is going to go perform a certain service. That's important. It does not replace a function of ESDs potentially advocating for what's in the interest of their district. So it's all three. It's coordination and collaboration, and also the ability for these ESDs to disagree with the city and say, this is actually your policy that you're doing here is not in the interest of our district, and we want you to change it, or we want you to do this other thing. So it's all three things that happen. And I think our recommendation is that continue to happen with stronger coordination and collaboration with city services.
So kind of unrelated, but my second question. So I appreciate the comments about the assessment, not only the process, but I guess the amounts and whether they're fair or not. And the fact that the current assessment process is maybe antiquated, it's the wrong word, but it's based on old data. There are a number of issues with it. And I think you've also noted several sort of examples of, and I'll speak specifically to condominiums, where condominiums have a cap. And Washington DC was one. Seattle has at least two, maybe more that have caps. So it's interesting to me that with that model that you, I think, highlighted as best practice, we've got condominiums in Portland, hundreds paying anywhere from 3 to even 6 times the caps we're seeing in other major cities. So where I'm getting to is why should this be so difficult to get right? One, and two, if we just had sort of our update, why should we wait for the next approval when we've got some things that are highlighted as being way out of sort of, maybe not the norm, but way out of what is best practice? Why wait? In the case of downtown, like to say, why wait years, several, I don't know, the next one's a couple of years away. Why would we wait to try to fix something that's clearly not close to best practice?
So why don't I say something, and Brian, you can. So it is a national, we are seeing different ways that residential is being assessed. You mentioned condos, but also residential renters or renter apartments. In some cases, hotels, different type of have caps. It is very important that, as we mentioned in one of our first slides, assessment methods and methodologies are responsive to local decisions. So their local preference in terms of what that formula looks like. And of course, then working with the city to understand what the data needs are and kind of what would that do to the assessment. So that is best practice. And it should be generated by the kind of local practitioners of that. And so in our recommendations, we say the city should consider residential caps, but again, working in the local context. Now, you want to answer anything you want to add to that? Yeah.
I certainly agree with what you said about it being a local decision. And I think whether or not you would go into it before a district was up for renewal or not would be one of those local, I mean, your point is well taken. And our sense was if you tried to get all the assessments to be with transparent, publicly available data, it would change the calculus of how the relative assessments of everybody would be quite a lot while you're doing it. And that would be challenging within the organization because some people would pay more, some people would pay less. It would be hard to do. So we were trying to not say, by God, you got to do it tomorrow. That's basically was our rationale. Your point, your question is well taken though, and I don't know, that would, to me, that would be a thing that the district itself would need to consider whether or not that makes sense to make those moves and how fast.
And I'll just observe that going through a confirmation process or a reconfirmation process is a very heavy lift for most organizations, even for the biggest organizations that we work with, like downtown Seattle or some of the other bigger cities. And so capacity of being able to do that accurately is also something that often is considered. But I do think that should be a local.
It would take an act of the city council.
Correct. We have a question.
I have a few questions in the chat that I think are related. Yep. So Anita, that was your question. I think it's tied, Christopher, to your questions. And so Anita had asked, how do you keep a government accountable for basic services? And Christopher had asked, do ESDs produce analysis or reports of the issues that are impacting ratepayers? If so, how can the ESDs engage around advocacy and policy? And I think those two questions, I'm sure you all can find great ways to relate them.
Okay, so the first one is our understanding that, especially in the reconfirmation, there is now an agreement of a basic service contract as part of the confirmation of an ESD or a new ESD. And that is as important to be followed as what the ESD says that they are going to be doing. The city should be held accountable to what they said that they would continue to provide in the basic service agreement. Now, it is our assessment that that isn't happening. And one of the reasons that we convened the ESD services within the bureaus was to start to better organize that. And we recommend that continue to happen so that folks can understand not just what their individual bureau commitment is to the ESD, or what the city of Portland's like comprehensive commitment is through these basic service agreements. And it is very appropriate for an ESD to say to the city, hey, we are in this agreement and you are not meeting this, this, and this. Just like it's appropriate for the city to say, you said that you were going to do these things and you're not doing them in this way. And that is how you have mutual accountability. So it needs to be both ways, and that kind of back and forth engagement amongst the city and the ESD in order to really promote accountability across the board. So that's that question. I do think that on the other question, some of the ESDs are providing a lot of good data and analysis, accountability already in terms of the types of services that they're doing. And at times, I think it is a national best practice for ESD to play that kind of data analysis role for example, storefront retail. You have an example in Pioneer Square in Seattle, where they hired a retail recruiter to help fill vacant storefronts. And they did that by collecting first robust retail analysis and data that they shared with their ratepayers. That informed what kind of business will come in and activate those storefronts. And so it is appropriate for ESDs to play that role. It is appropriate for them to share that data apart in different ways, periodically through newsletters, certainly in the annual report. I know that I think Clean and Safe and some of the others are doing that actively right now. That is a national best practice. There could always be more of that. So I think that's appropriate.
It's pretty common for ESDs to publish reports about the state of various elements of their districts and challenges they're facing. And sometimes they're doing that to use for business improvement. Sometimes they're using it to, encourage the city to have policy or prioritize budget items that they think will help. It's pretty common activity.
It's also common, for example, in Soto, in the example we showed, the city was considering a policy decision around transportation impacts. And so Soto funded their own analysis of how those transportation impacts would impact Soto, and they presented that to the city as well as their ratepayers. And that's the way that they were able to influence policy, and they presented that to the mayor and the elected officials as well. So there's different ways of doing that. Sometimes they do that individually. Sometimes they do that collectively in the Seattle BIA's model that we're talking. Other questions in the chat?
I do, but let's go to the room to see if there's anything.
Yes.
So I just want a quick question. So one of the recommendations about
I think national best practice, and we referenced it here, and it's more, you'll see it in more detail in our report, is meeting minutes, agendas, kind of budgets, as we mentioned, to be posted centrally so that folks can access that, certainly ratepayers and at times the broader public, on a centralized website. For example, the ESD's website, that's very easy to say, in an about us section, this is when we meet, these are the minutes of the last meeting, here's what was discussed, here's the agenda for the next meeting. And national best practice is to do that. There's certainly ESDs or BIAs that go above that, but I think posting meeting minutes centrally so that they're accessible is.
I was wondering about with meetings. So I remember one of the best practices was saying that ratepayers should be able to go to meetings, but that didn't specify that just the public would be able to go. So what's the reason for that?
So best practice that we see across it kind of depends. I think Brian was mentioning that increasingly more of the BIAs or place management organizations, ESDs, are opening meetings up to the ratepayers and periodically opening it up to the public as well, and or achieving public outreach and engagement in other ways. For example, public town halls, every kind of certain cadence throughout the year. So it depends on kind of what the standard is locally, and also it depends on, there's certain cases where there might be an executive board meeting, which is very relative to what what the board needs to discuss that might not be for broader public consumption. And I think we see more and more that folks are doing things like open houses, annual meetings, ratepayer meetings, public meetings, participating so that they can still preserve that real transparency and accountability, both to the ratepayers and broader public. Right? I think, yeah.
I have one more question.
And then we'll go to you after. Yeah.
Okay, one more question in the chat. This is from Ashley Henry. And we've got some quoting Brian in here. Brian talks about the ratepayer board getting their money's worth. And there's a question around Clean and Safe's board getting information and clarity around board agenda, meeting minutes, so on and so forth. I don't know if we have that clear answer for how they're doing that, but I know we have reports.
I don't think it's appropriate for us to dive into the specifics. I mean, our recommendation is that this is how ESDs should operate. And, I think there's things that are happening right now that are following and trending towards best practices. And there are things around meetings and posting meeting minutes, understanding who is on the board, how to get onto the board, how those elections are kind of approved. Those are best practices, but I wouldn't want us to dive into specific.
Board members should have clear information about how the organization is being run.
Yes, correct.
Yep.
Yeah, so just again, it kind of relates to the role of ESDs and advocacy work. So say we lived in a city where the response time for 911 was like comparatively really slow compared to cities across the states, right? And ratepayers within the district were saying, hey, this is really affecting the business, our mobility, everyone from homeowners to businesses to tourists to even our houses. As an ESD, we were like, our research suggests that comparatively within other cities, the number of police officers we have is lowest in the nation. And in our work, in conversations with the city that sets the budget for such things, to advocate for, to solve the problem of multiple rate players requires that interaction with council. Right? Mm-hmm. So in order to solve the problem, in the discovery of that conversation, there's also a realization of actually this is a county issue. The city is within the county in order to address this problem because some of the challenges are at county buildings, which fall under the jurisdiction, which is the sheriff's office. Oh, they're struggling as well with issues. The ability to get increased qualified personnel to deal with issues that's another issue we have to now talk to the county chair about. And then if in that discovery you realize actually this is a statewide issue because DPS and Salem is got a bottleneck because all across the state, and the issue is the governor expanding the ability for. Yeah. So on the journey of trying to solve a problem requires conversations which could be qualified as advocacy work at multiple levels to solve the local problem over time. Is that reasonable compared to best practices?
So I would say that. So let me repeat the question. In a hypothetical that you outlined, maybe you are noticing through your data and research around police response times that they're slow, that you want to advocate to the city or to the city council. You then realize that it's a county issue, then you want to maybe go and talk with them, then you realize it's a state issue and you want to talk with the state. Is that reasonable? Is that a best practice? I would say, first and foremost, so I would say, yes, that is reasonable. And we see that.
Just 1 second. This Andres is the right person to answer this question. I need to apologize. I need to step out of a public meeting to get to across the country. I've been on a plane all night. I'm sorry. So thank you all for being here. Andres is the right guy to answer that question.
Safe travels. Thank you. So I think it would be important for that said person, staff member, to understand and for the board to understand that police times are something that are important to the district and the ratepayers that are supporting the ESD. So assuming that that's the case, that they've said we collectively know that police response times in this case are important to us, then that is a priority of the ESDs that you would say, if this thing would improve, our district might improve. So it's very appropriate clarity and transparency to say, I'm here to talk to you about police response time, city council member. They are affecting this ESD in this way. We've done data. I'd like to show that to you. Same with the governor, same with any sort of elected official. That is different than perhaps having a political interaction, which then starts to blur the lines. So advocacy, we see nationally, is something that that ESDs, BIAs, place management organizations do often, but it's a very aligned with a clear set of priorities. The board should know that you are doing those types of things, and the ratepayers should hear about the results of that at some sort of meeting or regular interaction. Other questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
One last question.
Sure.
So basically it's just a broader term, best practices. So you
Sure.
keep using that term. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on like what your definition of that is, because to me, it kind of just sounds like it's what most of the bids are doing across the country. But I would argue that some of the things that a lot of bids are doing aren't necessarily best practices. So I'm wondering if you have any other factors that you put in when determining best practices.
And we had a slide here of what, in our opinion, doing this across the country builds vital districts. And when we reference best practices, we are referencing things that are adding to that definition of vitality. And it was things like design, marketing, retail business support, hospitality, safety, et cetera, and so on. So we define best practices as something that that is leaning towards that. We also find best practices as things that are encouraging transparency and accountability of kind of ratepayer dollars that is our paying for that. So
I have an addition as well.
Yeah.
There is an international downtown association that helps govern placemaking organizations like this. And we and other place management organizations and affiliates pull data from their collected resources and their best practices as well.
International Downtown Association, yeah. Some of it did, and a lot of it then is compared to what we are seeing working across different states, understanding that different local contexts allow and suggest certain things. And certainly, our recommendation to the city is going to be, these are what we're seeing nationally, and we encourage you to do these things. And in some cases, we think you should consider it. In some cases, you think you should require it. And ultimately, the city is going to say, this is what is appropriate for a local context.
And then lastly, I don't know if we're going to get to it in this presentation box, so I guess the question is kind of like, what are the next steps?
Sure. So this presentation and meetings being recorded, that will be posted on the ESD website, the city's ESD website. This presentation will be posted there as well as our report. And I will say in the next couple of days, we will have public comment available where we will be hearing from anybody that wants to weigh in on those recommendations and our findings till January 15th. And we will take up from January 15th to when we need to transmit to council and go in front of the council, which we think is probably the middle of February, to read those public comments, to make make a summary of what those public comments are, and to include those public comments as part of our transmission to the city council for their consideration.
I have one in the chat. I'm sorry, Eric, and then I will come back to you. There's a question on whether or not it is a best practice for staff of an ESD to pay fees to serve on a board of directors of the affiliated organization. And I know this is a really specific question.
Staff of an ESD to pay fees to serve on the board of the managing organization. Not sure I understand the question. So I won't answer a question I don't understand. But if you want to clarify it in the chat or want to come off mute.
Yeah, Ashley, do you want to come off mute briefly?
Mm,
I didn't even see her.
okay.
Let's go to Eric and then Ashley, let's get you, we'll get you set up.
So back to the coordination and collaboration, I'd love to hear an example of a best practice and how that works between a city and an ESD. And then secondly, one of your recommendations, I think, is for ESDs not necessarily to have to follow the strict city contractual requirements.
Mhm.
Is that a strong recommendation you're going to make? And if it is, can you just state it again, what exactly you're going to recommend?
Yeah, let me take the first one first and all. So good collaboration and coordination with the ESDs in the city. So an example is, as you might imagine, the city has different services spread across different bureaus. Those bureaus on certain schedules and certain kind of timelines are performing those services, whether it be parks or on the streets or throughout the district. A great example of how this of collaboration could be clarity in terms of when those services are going to be provided, so that the ESD can better plan for those services to happen in their district. They can communicate with their ratepayers. They can communicate with other impacted stakeholders of businesses that maybe aren't ratepayers but are going to be impacted. For example, if a sidewalk is going to be clean or there's some sort of need to shut down a portion of the street for a bike lane, and they can have more information sooner, so that then the ESD can be a partner with the city to communicate to those stakeholders. And now, if you can imagine that just in one bureau, if you can imagine that across all the different bureaus, doing that at scale and having some predictability of service, that is a way that potentially there could be some coordination and collaboration that's impacting their district. So just as an example.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? You also mentioned you got together with several departments within the city of Portland, got them together and talked about this. So on a more formal going forward basis, what would that look like?
So our recommendation is at least biannual convening held by the ESD coordinator, Devin, to be able to kind of report out of trends and things that they're seeing in the district, to report out on what kinds of services they're providing, to review again the things like the ESD scope of service, the basic city service agreement, and to do some brainstorming and relationship building among the staff themselves, so that they're able to understand the local context of what's happening in the district and they can respond better as a city. So that's, I think, what it could look like. However, that could be determined at kind of a later point. Our recommendation at this point is that meeting should happen more frequently. Procurement. So it is our understanding that the city put forward some procurement standards that include certain requirements of contracting, so that the city has said, when you are contracting for your services, the services that we listed, security, safety, other types of recruitment or other types of things, you must meet these certain criteria, or your contractors must meet these certain criteria. We are, through our investigation, research, and conversations, we have determined that some of those things are preventing some ESDs in some of their services from kind of hiring local companies that maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of the local context of what's happening on the ground, and have caused a kind of delay in service implementation because of that. And also then have to hire at a national scale, which maybe are bigger organizations that have more capacity and ability to meet some of those requirements. So I think in the language right now, we're saying that the city should consider, and that's where we're leaving it for right now. And That's the reason behind it.
Okay, Ashley, we're at 5:45, and so Ashley, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you, and I know that you have some really specific questions, and or actually I'm gonna have Devin unmute you. And I would like to leave a little bit of time left, so Ashley, if you can be succinct in your questions, just so we can wrap up here. And Devin, I believe you're helping me get her unmuted. Is that correct?
Hey, can you hear me now?
There you are.
Okay, thanks. I think I've already typed my question pretty explicitly in the chat. I'm not sure what else you want me to add.
Well, I can go ahead and read your question. I just wanted to give you an
Okay.
opportunity. I said I would unmute
Okay.
you.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so the question is, please speak specifically to the current practices that the ED of Downtown Clean and Safe is both an employee of Portland Business Alliance and also pays a fee in order to have a board seat on the PBA's board.
I'm not aware of that second part, and so I will address that first part. It is very common across the country that, again, I mentioned this earlier, that certain staff kind of share, are paid for and share kind of certain responsibilities across the functions that Brian had talked about on the left. Some of them which are paid for by ESD functions or ESD dollars, ratepayer dollars. Some of them might not be paid. That is common. What needs to go hand in hand with that is clarity at the board level and amongst ratepayers of kind of how their money is being used to support certain staff. And so that is certainly best practice. It is very common. In fact, in a lot of the organizations that we just mentioned, including Downtown Seattle Association, where there are shared staff because of capacity issues or because of need, where the staff is being paid for by different funds. The clarity and transparency around that is what's key. That there's no kind of assumptions or no misunderstandings of what's going on. I cannot speak to the other portion because that wasn't part of our analysis.
In a moment here, so what I'm going to do, Devin, can you please unmute Anita quickly to ask your question, Anita?
Okay.
This is actually small.
Okay, yeah, go ahead,
Okay.
Anita.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Say, our district there, the Clean and Safe District, continues to amass net assets. In other words, it seems like they have more money left at the end of the year from ratepayers than they are spending. And it's up now $3-4 million. So can you tell us if that's normal? Is that happening nationwide? And is it just an unended amount of money that the ESD can amass with ratepayer? Our rates went up 7.35% in 1 year.
Okay, so there's a couple of comments there and a question. I think it is common that, and there's an expectation that the ESD board and through the things that we've said, annual meetings, outreach, and the broader ratepayers understand the budget. And if there's budget carryover, they understand that there's budget carryover, and those decisions are visible to the board. And there's a whole bunch of maybe reasons why an organization is underspending or shifting things around that's important to their local context. So there are examples where certain organizations in Seattle come to mind where because of other funds that were received, they were able to leverage some of those funds in a way that from, like, let's say the federal government or state government to provide certain types of services that then replaced some funds. But what's key again is that there's clarity and transparency of what that is. And so that the ratepayer board and then the ratepayers can understand that the money that they're putting forward to provide certain services is going to that. And if there are changes within those within that, that's clear as to why. And so so that's what I would say is best practice.
Great. Just for a moment here, yeah, because we're almost out of time. Devin, can you please remind folks about the public process quickly?
Okay,
Yes.
yeah,
Can you
Go
see
ahead.
and hear me?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. For those that are, by the way, my name is Devin Reynolds. I'm the new Enhanced Services District Coordinator for the City of Portland. If you are on Zoom in the chat feature, several times I've listed links where the recording of this meeting, as well as the slide deck in this meeting, links where that will live, and you can find it here later this week at that website. And then also too, BDS's draft recommendations will also be posted later this week online as well. And there's a link in the chat for that as well. If you also got my email this afternoon, everyone who had RSVP'd for this meeting got an email from me this afternoon. I also included those links in that as well. If for some reason you did not get that email, please do reach out and I'll make sure to make that available to you as soon as possible.
Great, thank you, Devin. Alyssa,
Yeah, go ahead, Alyssa.
Devin, can we unmute Alyssa, please?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for this presentation. I seem to recall when the former ESD coordinator, Sean Campbell, held a handful of public sessions. I believe that was last year or 2 years ago. There were a lot of public commenters who had feedback about kind of this existential question of ESDs and whether or not they should even exist, with a lot of people feeling that they should not. I've heard a lot in this presentation about best practices, and you also mentioned at the beginning that your team had a lot of experience firsthand working in what you call, I believe, place management organizations. But so I guess I'm curious if that potential bias in favor of ESDs is addressed at all in your research or your methodology. And also a second question, I guess, is if you plan to include any of this feedback that people didn't want ESDs or have questions about whether they should exist either in your report or your public presentation.
Okay, there's a couple questions there. I'll try to address them. We do a lot of work with place management organizations throughout the country. We are recommending that the city invest in and continue to expand place management districts and stronger economic development collaboration for these organizations. We work in a lot of contexts where place management districts are in strong partnership with even those that maybe have some disagreements with some of the things and activities that they're performing, and kind of in some cases there's a requirement to have kind of more intentional conversations with those folks. They can think of several examples where Brian's going to in Rochester, in Seattle, and throughout the country. We did read those public comments as part of our research. We in the report reference that step and attempt to summarize some of the concerns. I think is appropriate comment for us to say, or for you to say, are you going to push those forward? The council, our understanding is the council and the mayor have seen those comments as well. I think it is also appropriate for us as we summarize the public engagement we get from between now and January 15th to also include some of those other comments as well, so that it provides the broader context of feedback that we heard. I think that's how I would answer that.
We are just about at time.
Okay. So I want to thank everybody. There were some other questions I think that are being recorded that were more specific for somebody in public to address those, or the purpose of this meeting isn't necessarily to do that. However, I think they're recorded in the record there. I will say that there is an opportunity to submit formal comments, as we mentioned, between now and January 15th. I would not say that even though this is being recorded, you would consider this a formal comment period. I mean, this is more of us to share our initial findings and recommendations, and to kind of launch into that next step of formal comment. So you might ask, how can I do that? That information will be listed on the ESD website. It'll be very clear in terms of how and who you can send those comments to. And so we really appreciate everybody's time and good discussion and feedback. You know, and hopefully you've have enjoyed this time, understanding what we've been doing for the last couple of months. So appreciate it, and I think we'll go ahead and adjourn there and stop the recording, and we'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.